Spring 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final months. Across the Atlantic, far from the ruined cities of Germany, rows of wooden barracks stood quietly behind barbed wire in a prisoner of war camp in the United States. Inside one of those barracks sat a group of recently captured German women, nurses, radio clerks, and administrative auxiliaries who had been taken during the chaotic collapse of the German fronts. Many had expected harsh captivity. Some had imagined endless interrogations or exhausting labor. That had been the pattern they had been warned about throughout their service in World War II. Instead, the morning routine in the camp seemed strangely calm. American guards moved along the gravel paths with clipboards and quiet voices. A notice had been posted outside the administration building. The message was short but unexpected. The camp command intended to open a small school inside the compound. Even more surprising, the notice explained that educated prisoners would be allowed to help organize the classes. For women raised under the rigid authority of Nazi Germany, the idea sounded almost impossible. Prisoners helping organize education inside a POW camp. The announcement left many of them silent, uncertain whether this was a misunderstanding or the beginning of something they had never imagined in captivity. And to understand why this moment felt so strange to them, the story must begin earlier in the shifting tides of the war itself. By the summer of 1944, the balance of World War II had shifted decisively against Nazi Germany. For nearly 5 years, German forces had dominated much of Europe, but by mid-1944, the war was closing in from every direction. In the east, the massive Soviet offensives were pushing relentlessly toward Germany's borders. In the west, Allied armies had returned to continental Europe through the beaches of Normandy during the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944. The German military machine, once known for speed and coordination, was now struggling under the weight of constant pressure. Supplies were limited. Transportation networks were damaged by bombing. Entire formations were being forced into retreat. As the fronts collapsed, hundreds of thousands of German personnel began falling into Allied hands. Among them were not only soldiers. During the later years of the war, Germany had mobilized large numbers of women into auxiliary services. These women worked in communication centers, hospitals, clerical offices, and supply depots. Some served with anti-aircraft units or administrative staffs. They were not typically frontline combatants, but they were part of the military system supporting the German war effort. Many of these women were captured during the rapid Allied advances of 1944 and early 1945. When American units pushed through towns, airfields, and headquarters facilities, they often encountered groups of German auxiliaries who had been left behind as German formations retreated. In many cases, the women surrendered alongside wounded soldiers, medical staff, and logistical personnel who could no longer escape the advancing armies. Once captured, these prisoners became part of a vast logistical challenge. The Allies were suddenly responsible for managing enormous numbers of prisoners. By the final year of the war, millions of Axis personnel had been taken into custody across multiple theaters. Housing, feeding, and supervising them required careful planning. The United States developed one solution that surprised many observers. Instead of keeping every prisoner in Europe, large numbers were transported across the Atlantic to camps inside the United States. These facilities were often built in rural areas where land was plentiful and security could be maintained more easily. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States would hold more than 400,000 German prisoners in hundreds of camps scattered across the country. Many Americans living near these camps had never seen German soldiers before. The war had been fought thousands of miles away, yet subtly enemy prisoners were living behind fences only a short distance from American towns. The camps themselves varied in size. Some held only a few hundred prisoners, while larger installations housed several thousand. Rows of barracks, guard towers, mess halls, and medical buildings formed small, controlled communities. Despite the obvious tension of wartime captivity, these camps operated under strict legal guidelines. The treatment of prisoners was governed by the Geneva Convention of 1929, an international agreement that established rules for handling prisoners of war. The convention required that captured personnel be given adequate food, shelter, and medical care. It also prohibited certain forms of punishment or forced labor. American authorities took these obligations seriously. Camp commanders were instructed to maintain conditions that met the standards of international law. Inspectors visited facilities regularly, and detailed reports were written about daily operations. This approach created a strange contrast. While the war raging overseas was defined by destruction, bombed cities shattered armies and millions of displaced civilians, many POW camps in the United States functioned with quiet order. Meals were scheduled. Medical services were provided. Work details were organized when allowed under the convention. And over time, American administrators began to realize something important. Idle prisoners could become restless prisoners. Keeping thousands of people behind fences for months, or even years, required more than guards and barbed wire. It required structure, routine, and purpose. This realization would eventually lead to an idea that seemed unusual at first, an idea that would bring books, lessons, and classrooms into a place originally built only for confinement. But before that plan could emerge, the environment inside the camps and the people living within them had to evolve through months of captivity and adjustment. And that story continues in the next stage of the war's hidden history. When German prisoners first arrived in the United States, the journey itself had already reshaped their expectations. Captured personnel were transported across the Atlantic aboard guarded troop ships. The voyages were long and tightly controlled. Prisoners remained under watch during the entire crossing, uncertain where they were being taken. For many, the destination was unimaginable. They had grown up hearing about America through propaganda broadcasts and wartime speeches inside Nazi Germany. Yet few had ever expected to see the country themselves, especially as prisoners. When the ships finally reached American ports, the prisoners were moved by train to camps scattered across the interior of the country. Some were sent to the wide plains of Texas. Others traveled to camps in Arizona, Kansas, Colorado, or the forests of the Midwest. The distances were enormous. For the first time, many prisoners began to realize how vast the United States truly was. By the time they arrived at their assigned camps, the first surprise often appeared immediately. The camps were orderly but not brutal. Barbed wire fences surrounded the compounds, and guard towers watched the perimeter. Armed American soldiers controlled the gates. Yet inside the fences, daily life followed a structured routine rather than the harsh discipline many prisoners had expected. Barracks were arranged in neat rows. Mess halls provided regular meals. Medical buildings treated illness and injury. Showers, laundry areas, and recreation fields were established in many camps. According to the rules of the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners were entitled to adequate living conditions, and American authorities generally followed these guidelines carefully. For many German prisoners, the experience was confusing. They had been raised in a wartime system built on strict hierarchy and constant propaganda. Enemy nations were often described as ruthless or cruel. But inside these camps, American guards frequently behaved in ways that contradicted those expectations. Guards issued orders, but they also followed procedures. Complaints were recorded. Medical problems were treated quickly. Food was distributed according to rations that were sometimes comparable to those of American soldiers themselves. The daily schedule created a rhythm. Morning roll call confirmed that everyone was present. Work details were organized for certain prisoners when allowed by international law. Some prisoners helped maintain the campgrounds, repaired buildings, or worked in nearby agricultural fields under supervision. But many hours of the day remained unstructured. Camp administrators soon recognized the risks of long stretches of inactivity. Thousands of prisoners confined together without meaningful activity could easily become frustrated or hostile. Maintaining stability required more than rules. It required engagement. As a result, many camps gradually introduced organized activities. Sports competitions were common. Soccer fields appeared inside several compounds, and tournaments between barracks teams became regular events. Music groups formed as well. Prisoners who had once played instruments organized small orchestras or bands to perform inside the camps. Libraries were also introduced. Books arrived through various channels. Some were provided by American organizations interested in promoting education and cultural exchange. Others came through programs designed to encourage reading among prisoners during captivity. These libraries became unexpectedly popular. Prisoners spent hours reading newspapers, novels, or textbooks. For many, reading provided a temporary escape from the uncertainty of war and imprisonment. It also revealed a reality that differed from what they had previously been taught about American society. Among the prisoners were individuals with university education, teaching experience, or professional training. Some had worked as teachers, engineers, nurses, or clerks before the war. Camp administrators began to notice this. If prisoners already possessed knowledge and skills, perhaps those abilities could be used inside the camp itself. Education could fill the long hours of captivity, while also creating a more stable environment. The idea slowly took shape. Instead of simply offering books, camps could organize actual classes. Subjects might include languages, mathematics, technical skills, or general education. Structured learning would give prisoners a goal during their confinement. In several camps, small informal classes began to appear. At first, these gatherings were simple. A few prisoners would meet inside a barracks to study English vocabulary or practice writing. Someone with teaching experience might explain grammar or arithmetic while others listened. American camp officers observed these efforts carefully. The results were encouraging. Prisoners who participated in classes appeared calmer and more cooperative. Education created a sense of purpose that routine labor alone could not provide. Eventually, some camp commanders considered a larger step. Instead of informal lessons organized quietly by prisoners, why not allow a structured school program inside the camp? The idea was unusual for a prisoner of war facility, yet it fit within the broader philosophy guiding many American camps. Maintain order, follow international law, and encourage stability through routine and responsibility. But implementing such a program would require cooperation from the prisoners themselves. And that moment, the proposal that prisoners might actually help organize and run parts of the camp's educational system would produce reactions that few American officers had anticipated. For the German women who had arrived expecting strict captivity, the suggestion felt almost unreal. Their reaction would reveal much about the differences between wartime expectations and the reality they were now experiencing. The idea of creating a school inside a prisoner of war camp did not appear dramatic on the surface. It involved classrooms, books, and structured lessons, things that normally belong to ordinary civilian life. But within the guarded fences of a wartime detention camp, the proposal carried deeper meaning. For the German women held in the compound, the announcement created a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Many of them had entered captivity with deeply ingrained expectations. During the war years, propaganda inside Nazi Germany had described enemy nations as hostile and unforgiving. Prisoners were often told that surrender could lead to humiliation or harsh treatment. These warnings had been repeated through speeches, radio broadcasts, and official training programs. Yet the environment inside the American camp did not match those predictions. The guards followed regulations. Orders were given calmly. Inspections were routine rather than threatening. And now, unexpectedly, the camp administration was discussing the possibility of organized education. For some prisoners, the idea sounded suspicious. They wondered whether the school might be a form of political instruction designed to reshape their beliefs. Others suspected it might simply be a way to keep prisoners occupied. But the announcement contained one detail that surprised them most. The camp commander intended to allow qualified prisoners to help organize the program. Among the captured women were individuals with significant education. Some had studied languages or mathematics before the war. Others had worked as nurses, typists, or administrative assistants. A few had attended universities or teacher training institutes before entering wartime service. American officers reviewing the prisoner records quickly noticed these backgrounds. Instead of bringing in outside instructors, the camp administration considered using the skills already present inside the compound. Prisoners who possessed academic knowledge could assist in teaching certain subjects to fellow detainees. From a practical standpoint, the idea made sense. Running a school required organization. Class schedules had to be prepared. Materials needed to be distributed. Lessons had to be planned. Allowing prisoners to participate in these tasks reduced the burden on camp staff, while also giving the detainees a structured responsibility. But for the German women hearing this proposal, the concept was unfamiliar. In the system they had known before captivity, authority flowed strictly downward through rigid chains of command. Orders came from superiors, and subordinates obeyed. The idea that prisoners might cooperate with their captors to organize educational activities seemed to challenge that familiar structure. This cultural contrast formed the second dimension of the moment. American camp administrators viewed education primarily as a practical tool. Structured activity reduced tension and helped maintain discipline. It also aligned with the broader American belief that learning could improve society and encourage individual development. Inside the camp, however, the prisoners had been shaped by a very different wartime environment. Education in Germany during the years of World War II had often been closely connected to ideology and state authority. Schools emphasized loyalty, discipline, and obedience. Many prisoners had grown accustomed to systems where learning served political goals as much as intellectual ones. Because of this background, some of the women initially struggled to understand the purpose of the American proposal. Why would a camp commander allow prisoners to take part in organizing educational activities? What benefit could this possibly bring to the authorities controlling the camp? For the American administration, however, the answer was straightforward. Prisoner of war camps were complex communities. Maintaining stability required thoughtful management. The guidelines of the Geneva Convention of 1929 emphasized humane treatment and reasonable living conditions, but they did not specify how camps should fill the long hours of each day. Experience had already shown that idleness could create problems. Prisoners who had nothing to do often became restless. Minor disputes could escalate. Frustration could spread through entire barracks. Organized work programs and recreational activities helped, but they did not always engage everyone in the compound. Education offered another solution. Classes created routine. They required preparation and concentration. They encouraged cooperation among prisoners rather than competition or conflict. And perhaps most importantly, they transformed long periods of waiting into opportunities for learning. From the perspective of the camp administration, the plan was both practical and efficient. But from the perspective of the German women standing in the yard and reading the posted notice, the proposal felt unexpected. They had arrived in captivity expecting strict confinement and little personal agency. Now, they were being asked to help build something resembling a school inside a place that had originally been designed only to hold them. The idea lingered in conversations across the barracks that evening. Some prisoners remained skeptical. Others began quietly wondering what such a school might actually look like. And within days, the first steps toward that experiment would begin. Once the idea of a camp school moved from discussion to planning, the concept slowly began to take shape inside the compound. The first step was identifying prisoners who possessed the skills needed to teach. Camp administrators reviewed prisoner records and interviewed individuals with educational backgrounds. Among the German women were former teachers, university students, nurses with medical training, and clerks who had studied bookkeeping or languages before the war. These qualifications suddenly became valuable. Inside a prisoner of war camp, knowledge could transform an ordinary barracks room into something resembling a classroom. Wooden tables could serve as desks. A chalkboard mounted against the wall could turn lectures into structured lessons. Gradually, a simple curriculum began to emerge. Language classes quickly became one of the most requested subjects. Many prisoners wanted to learn English, partly to communicate more easily with guards and administrators, and partly because they believed the language might be useful after the war. Some prisoners also offered lessons in German grammar or literature for those who had received limited schooling before entering military service. Mathematics courses appeared as well. Arithmetic and basic accounting were useful skills, especially for prisoners who had worked in technical or administrative roles before the war. For the American Camp Command, these classes served several purposes. First, they filled the long hours of captivity with structured activity. Prisoners preparing for lessons spent time reading, writing notes, or helping organize materials. The process created a daily routine that reduced boredom and tension. Second, education encouraged cooperation. Running classes required coordination between prisoners and camp staff. Books had to be distributed. Rooms had to be scheduled. Attendance lists were maintained to track participation. These small administrative tasks created an environment where prisoners were actively engaged in maintaining order within their own community. But there was also a deeper layer to the program. American officials recognized that education could have psychological effects as well. By the later stages of World War II, many Allied policymakers believed that rebuilding Europe after the war would require more than military victory. It would also involve encouraging democratic ideas and open discussion among populations that had lived under authoritarian systems. Inside POW camps, education programs sometimes introduced books and materials that reflected a wider range of viewpoints than prisoners had previously encountered. Discussions about history, economics, and literature created opportunities for intellectual curiosity rather than strict ideological instruction. However, it is important to understand that the school programs were not designed as aggressive political campaigns. Camp commanders were primarily concerned with maintaining stability and morale. The classes existed mainly to provide structure and encourage productive activity. Any broader influence on prisoner perspectives developed gradually through exposure to new information rather than direct confrontation. From the prisoner's perspective, reactions to the school varied widely. Some of the German women embraced the opportunity almost immediately. For individuals who had once hoped to pursue academic careers before the war interrupted their lives, teaching offered a return to something familiar. Preparing lessons and explaining subjects to fellow prisoners restored a sense of identity that captivity had temporarily erased. Others remained cautious. Years of propaganda had warned them that enemy nations might attempt to manipulate prisoners through cultural programs. A few women initially refused to participate in classes, preferring to keep distance from any activity connected to camp administration. But curiosity gradually overcame suspicion for many. The classrooms were simple, but they created moments of normalcy within an abnormal environment. Students gathered at tables with notebooks and pencils. Teachers wrote words on chalkboards. Questions were asked and answered in quiet conversations. For a brief time each day, the camp no longer felt like a prison. It felt more like a place of learning. These small educational communities began to spread across the several barracks. As word of the classes circulated, more prisoners asked to participate. Subjects expanded. Some lessons focused on geography or literature, while others explored practical topics, such as bookkeeping or nursing techniques. American guards observing the activity noticed a change. Where long idle hours had once produced restlessness, the camp now displayed a different rhythm. Groups of prisoners walked between barracks carrying books. Discussions about grammar or mathematics replaced some of the earlier arguments that had occasionally erupted among bored detainees. The experiment was working, yet the most important moment was still ahead. Because organizing classes was one thing. Transforming those small gatherings into a fully functioning school inside the camp would require a decision from the camp command itself. And when that decision finally arrived, it would mark the beginning of the story's most significant turning point. By early 1945, the quiet experiment taking place inside the camp had reached a decisive moment. For several weeks, small groups of prisoners had been gathering informally to study languages, mathematics, and other subjects. What began as scattered lessons inside individual barracks was gradually evolving into something more organized. Attendance was growing. Prisoners were asking for additional books. Some instructors were even preparing written lesson plans. Camp administrators could see the change clearly. The atmosphere inside the compound had shifted. Where long hours of inactivity had once produced frustration, the daily routine now included study periods, preparation for lessons, and conversations about academic topics. Groups of prisoners moved between buildings carrying notebooks and textbooks instead of simply waiting for the next meal or a roll call. For the officers responsible for running the camp, this development raised an important question. Should the administration formally recognize and support the emerging school? Under the guidelines of the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoner of war camps were allowed to provide educational opportunities. The convention did not require such programs, but it permitted them as long as they did not interfere with security or discipline. The camp command staff met to discuss the situation. Reports from guards and supervisors suggested that the informal classes were improving morale among the prisoners. Arguments and minor disciplinary problems had decreased. Prisoners participating in lessons appeared more cooperative during inspections and work assignments. The evidence pointed toward a clear conclusion. Education was helping maintain order. After reviewing these observations, the camp commander approved a plan that would transform the scattered classes into an official program. A notice was prepared and posted near the administration building. The message announced that the camp would establish a structured educational system inside the compound. Several barracks would be designated as classroom spaces. A schedule would be created so that different subjects could be taught at specific times throughout the week. Most importantly, the notice confirmed that qualified prisoners would be allowed to help organize and manage many aspects of the program. For the German women reading the announcement, the decision felt almost surreal. Only months earlier, they had been part of a wartime system dominated by rigid authority and strict hierarchy inside Nazi Germany. Now they were standing in a POW camp where the administration was inviting prisoners to participate in building an educational institution. The reaction across the barracks was immediate. Some prisoners approached the notice board repeatedly, rereading the message to make sure they had understood it correctly. Others gathered in small groups, discussing what the new program might involve. Would the classes remain informal, or would they become more structured? Who would decide which subjects were taught? And perhaps the most surprising question of all, which prisoners would now become teachers. Camp administrators soon began the process of selecting instructors and organizers. Prisoners with university education or professional training were asked to volunteer. Short interviews helped determine who possessed the experience needed to teach specific subjects. Former teachers and students of higher education quickly emerged as natural candidates. Among the German women were several individuals who had studied literature, science, and languages before the war interrupted their academic lives. Some had completed teacher training programs. Others had worked as nurses or technical assistants who understood complex medical or administrative procedures. These backgrounds suddenly became important again. Selected prisoners were given limited authority to help structure the new school. They assisted in drafting class schedules, organizing reading materials, and preparing simple lesson plans. Inside one of the larger barracks, wooden tables were rearranged to create rows of desks. A chalkboard was mounted against the wall. Boxes of books and notebooks were delivered by camp staff. The transformation was modest, but unmistakable. What had once been a sleeping quarters was becoming a classroom. For many prisoners, the moment carried an unexpected emotional weight. The simple act of preparing a lesson or arranging desks brought back memories of ordinary civilian life before the war. But the real turning point would come when the school opened its doors for the first full day of classes, because that moment would reveal whether the experiment, allowing prisoners to organize education inside a wartime camp, could truly function as intended. The morning the camp school officially opened arrived quietly. There were no ceremonies, no speeches, and no dramatic announcements. The compound followed its usual routine. Guards walked their posts along the fences. The morning roll call was conducted in the yard. Breakfast was served in the mess hall as it had been every day before. Yet something inside the camp had changed. After the meal, small groups of prisoners began walking toward one of the larger barracks near the center of the compound. Some carried notebooks or loose sheets of paper. Others held worn textbooks that had recently been distributed by the camp administration. A wooden sign had been placed near the entrance. It simply listed the day's subjects. Language lessons would begin in the morning. Mathematics would follow in the afternoon. Later sessions would include discussions of literature and practical skills, such as bookkeeping and medical organization. Inside the barracks, the transformation was visible. Tables had been arranged into rows. A chalkboard stood at the front of the room. A few shelves held stacks of books and writing materials. The space was simple, but it clearly resembled a classroom rather than a sleeping area. For the prisoners entering the room, the moment carried a strange mixture of emotions. Some approached their seats cautiously, uncertain how the program would function. Others appeared almost eager, curious to see whether the lessons would truly resemble the education they remembered from before the war. At the front of the room stood one of the newly appointed instructors, a German woman who had studied languages at university before joining administrative service during World War II. Now, in a prisoner of war camp thousands of miles from home, she prepared to begin the first official class. The lesson was simple. She wrote several English words on a chalkboard and began explaining their pronunciation and meaning. Students repeated the sounds carefully, comparing unfamiliar syllables with the structure of their native German language. The process was slow but focused. Outside the classroom windows, guards continued their normal patrols. The barbed wire fences remained in place. Watchtowers still overlooked the compound. Yet inside the room, the atmosphere felt different from the usual routines of captivity. For the next hour, the prisoners concentrated on vocabulary, grammar, and translation exercises. Questions were asked. Corrections were made. Laughter occasionally followed a difficult pronunciation. The rhythm of a classroom had replaced the quiet tension that often filled the barracks. Similar scenes unfolded across other parts of the camp. In another room, a mathematics lesson reviewed basic arithmetic and algebra. Students worked through problems on scraps of paper while the instructor explained formulas on the chalkboard. In a separate corner of the building, a small group gathered for a discussion of literature, reading passages aloud and analyzing their meaning. Each class was modest in size, but together they created something new within the compound, a functioning school. American camp officers observed the program carefully during its first days. Their goal was to ensure that the classes remained orderly and did not interfere with camp security. Guards occasionally stepped inside the classrooms to monitor activities, but their presence remained discreet. The results quickly became apparent. Participation grew steadily. Prisoners who had initially remained skeptical began attending out of curiosity. Some joined language lessons, hoping that learning English might prove useful in the uncertain years ahead. Others preferred mathematics or technical subjects that connected to their former professions. Within weeks, the schedule expanded. Additional classes were added to accommodate demand. Teachers prepared more detailed lessons. Students began forming study groups that met outside the official classroom hours. The school had become a regular part of daily life. For many prisoners, the experience created an unexpected sense of purpose. Instead of measuring time only through meals and roll calls, they now followed a schedule of lessons, assignments, and discussions. The transformation did not erase the reality of captivity. The fences were still there. Guards still controlled the gates. The war overseas continued to rage during those early months of 1945. But inside the classrooms, a different atmosphere existed, one defined not by conflict, but by learning. And as the school settled into routine, its influence would begin to shape the wider life of the camp in ways that neither the prisoners nor the administrators had fully anticipated. In the weeks following the opening of the camp school, the effect began to spread quietly through daily life inside the compound. At first, the change was subtle. Guards noticed that prisoners now moved to the camp with a clearer sense of purpose. Instead of long stretches of inactivity between roll calls and meals, the day had acquired a pattern of preparation and movement. Groups gathered in barracks to review lessons. Others walked toward classrooms carrying notebooks or borrowed textbooks. Conversations that once focused mainly on rumors about the war now included discussions about grammar rules, mathematics problems, or passages from books. For the camp administration, this shift confirmed what many officers had hoped when they approved the educational program. Structure was replacing idleness. Prisoner of war camps during World War II often faced the challenge of managing thousands of individuals who had suddenly been removed from their normal roles. Soldiers, nurses, clerks, and technicians who had once operated inside highly organized military systems now found themselves confined behind fences with little control over their future. Without routine, that uncertainty could become difficult to manage. The introduction of organized classes gave many prisoners a way to reclaim a small part of their former identity. A woman who had once studied languages could once again stand at a chalkboard explaining grammar. Someone who had worked with numbers before the war could help others solve mathematical problems. Teaching and learning restored a sense of usefulness. Among the German women in the camp, this change was particularly noticeable. Many had entered captivity expecting a passive existence, controlled entirely by their captors. Instead, the school allowed them to participate in shaping one aspect of their daily environment. They organized lesson schedules, helped distribute books, and prepared study materials for new students. These tasks did not grant freedom, but they did offer responsibility. American guards watching the program observed another important result. Discipline problems declined. Before the introduction of the school, long hours of waiting had sometimes produced arguments inside the barracks. Minor disputes could grow quickly in a crowded environment where prisoners had little personal space and few distractions. Now, many of those tensions were replaced by quieter activities. Students focused on assignments. Teachers prepared lectures. Study groups formed in the evenings to review lessons from earlier in the day. The shared goal of learning created cooperation among prisoners who might otherwise have remained isolated from one another. Reports written by camp administrators frequently mentioned this effect. Educational programs were described as valuable tools for maintaining morale and stability. The presence of organized intellectual activity helped transform the camp into a structured community rather than a collection of idle detainees. The influence of school also extended beyond the classroom itself. Some prisoners began applying their new knowledge in practical ways. English vocabulary helped them communicate more easily with camp staff. Mathematics lessons supported administrative tasks connected to food distribution or work details. Discussions about literature and history encouraged thoughtful conversations that stretched far beyond the immediate concerns of captivity. Even the guards occasionally noticed the difference. Instead of encountering only silence or tension during their patrols, they sometimes overheard prisoners debating translations, explaining equations, or reading aloud from books. These sounds of study created an unusual atmosphere for a wartime prison camp. The program did not eliminate every difficulty. Captivity remained captivity. Prisoners still faced uncertainty about their future, and news from Europe often reminded them that the war continued to reshape the world beyond the fences. But the school had introduced a new dimension to life inside the camp. It offered a temporary bridge between the structured world the prisoners had known before the war and the uncertain years that would follow its end. And as the months passed, that bridge would become even more important when the war in Europe finally reached its conclusion. By the spring of 1945, the global conflict that had reshaped the lives of millions was approaching its final stage in Europe. Across the continent, Allied armies were advancing steadily into the heart of Germany. Cities that had once served as administrative and industrial centers of Nazi Germany were falling one after another. Railways, factories, and command structures were collapsing under the pressure of sustained military operations. Then, in early May, the news arrived that would change the future of every prisoner inside the camp. Germany had surrendered. On May 8, 1945, the official end of the European conflict in World War II was announced across Allied nations. The moment, often remembered as Victory in Europe Day, marked the defeat of the German military and the conclusion of years of devastating fighting across the continent. Inside the POW camp, the announcement was received with mixed emotions. For the American guards and officers, the news represented the successful end of a long and costly campaign. Celebrations took place across cities and military bases throughout the United States. For the German prisoners, the moment carried a far more complex meaning. The war that had shaped their lives was now over. The government they had served had collapsed. Their homeland was occupied by Allied forces and deeply damaged by years of bombing and combat. At the same time, their own future remained uncertain. The end of hostilities did not immediately mean freedom. Prisoners of war were typically held until transportation and administrative arrangements could be made for their return home. With millions of prisoners scattered across different countries, the process of repatriation required careful coordination. For many German prisoners held in the United States, that process would take months or even years. During this transitional period, the routines established during captivity continued. Work programs remained in place. Recreational activities continued. And inside several camps, the schools that had formed during the war remained active. The classrooms were quieter now, but they still served a purpose. Prisoners preparing to return to Europe faced an uncertain future. Many cities in Germany had been heavily damaged. Economic systems were in disarray. Families had been separated by the chaos of war. Education became a way to prepare for rebuilding. Language lessons remained popular, especially English courses that some prisoners believed might help them communicate with Allied authorities during the occupation of Germany. Mathematics and bookkeeping classes also continued, offering practical skills that could be used once civilian life resumed. For the German women who had helped organize the camp school, the program carried a personal significance. Only months earlier, they had been captured during the final collapse of German forces. Many had arrived expecting strict confinement and isolation. Instead, they had spent the final stage of the war participating in a small educational community behind the fences of a POW camp. The experience did not erase the hardship of captivity, but it created moments of normal human activity during a period defined by global conflict. Eventually, preparations for repatriation began. Prisoners were gradually transported to ports where ships would carry them back across the Atlantic. From there, they would travel through occupied Germany, returning to cities and towns that had been transformed by years of destruction. For many, the journey home was both hopeful and sobering. They were leaving behind the strange routine of the POW camp, the barracks, the roll calls, the classrooms that had briefly filled the long hours of captivity. Ahead of them lay a country struggling to rebuild after one of the most devastating wars in human history. Yet the memory of those classrooms remained with some of them. Inside a place originally designed for confinement, they had rediscovered the familiar rhythm of teaching and learning. And that small experience hinted at something larger. Even during the final months of a global war, the simple act of education could create space for reflection, preparation, and change. War is usually remembered through battles, weapons, and the decisions of generals. The maps of World War II are filled with arrows marking offensives, retreats, and the movement of armies across continents. Yet the history of the war also unfolded in quieter places far from the front lines. Prisoner of war camps were among those places. Inside the United States, thousands of captured personnel from Nazi Germany lived for months or years behind guarded fences. Their lives were shaped by regulations established under the Geneva Convention of 1929, which attempted to preserve basic human standards even during global conflict. Within those boundaries, something unexpected sometimes occurred. In several camps, classrooms appeared. They were simple rooms, barracks rearranged with wooden tables, chalkboards, and stacks of books. But for the prisoners who gathered there, the lessons offered more than just information. They provided a brief return to ordinary life during an extraordinary moment in history. For the German women who helped organize those camp schools, the experience was especially striking. Only months earlier, they had been part of a wartime system defined by rigid hierarchy and constant propaganda. In captivity, they encountered a different environment, one where learning and cooperation were encouraged even between former enemies. The fences of the camp never disappeared. Yet inside the classrooms, another kind of structure took shape. Teachers prepared lessons. Students practiced unfamiliar languages. Discussions about literature, mathematics, and history replaced the silence of long idle hours. These moments did not change the outcome of the war, but they revealed something important about the world that would follow it. When the fighting ended and prisoners returned home to a devastated Europe, reconstruction required more than rebuilding cities and industries. It required rebuilding societies, and that process depended heavily on education, dialogue, and the exchange of ideas. In that sense, the small camp schools represented a quiet preview of the future. Even in the final months of a devastating conflict, learning had begun again. And sometimes, history is shaped not only by the battles that end wars, but by the classrooms that prepare the world that comes after them.